Ebola. The virus that terrified the world. There are moments in history when humanity faces an enemy it cannot see. No army marches across the border. No warning sirens sound. There are no explosions in the distance. Instead, everything begins quietly. A fever. A headache. A sudden weakness. Then, within days, a person who seemed perfectly healthy can become desperately ill. And somewhere, in a small village or a crowded city, doctors begin to realize that something is terribly wrong. This is the story of Ebola, a virus that emerged from the depths of Central Africa and became one of the most feared diseases on Earth. Its name became associated with fear, death, isolation, and images of exhausted medical workers covered from head to toe in protective equipment. But the history of Ebola is not only a story about a deadly virus. It is also a story about ordinary people. About doctors who walked into danger when everyone else was running away. About nurses who continued working despite knowing that every patient could be carrying an invisible threat. About families separated from their loved ones. And about a world that learned, sometimes painfully, that a disease appearing in one remote village could eventually become a global concern. This is the story of Ebola. And it begins in 1976. Chapter 1: The Mystery in Zaire. In the summer of 1976, something strange began happening in what was then known as Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The first signs were not unusual. A man became sick. He developed a fever. Then came weakness, headaches, and other symptoms. At first, nobody understood what they were dealing with. In a region where infectious diseases were already a major threat, doctors had seen many illnesses before. But this was different. The patient's condition deteriorated rapidly. Soon, more people began falling ill. Hospitals started receiving patients with similar symptoms. And then something even more alarming happened. The people caring for the sick began becoming sick themselves. Doctors and nurses who had treated patients without knowing the danger were suddenly developing the same mysterious illness. The disease was spreading. But no one knew exactly how. At the time, the medical world was familiar with viruses such as yellow fever and Marburg virus. But this new disease appeared to be something else. Something unknown. Something deadly. Scientists and medical teams rushed to investigate. The outbreak was centered around villages near the Ebola River. Eventually, the mysterious virus received the name that would become famous around the world: Ebola. The first outbreak was devastating. Hundreds of people became infected, and many died. But the outbreak also revealed something important. The virus was not spreading like influenza or measles. It did not appear to move easily through the air from one person to another. Instead, transmission was strongly associated with direct contact with infected bodily fluids. That meant blood, vomit, diarrhea, and other fluids could become dangerous sources of infection, especially when people cared for patients without adequate protective equipment. This created a terrible cycle. A person became sick. Their family cared for them. A nurse or doctor tried to help. Funeral traditions brought relatives and community members together. And without understanding the danger, the virus could move from one person to another. The first outbreak eventually came under control. But the world had been introduced to a new enemy. And Ebola would return. Chapter 2: The Silent Threat. For years after the first outbreaks, Ebola remained relatively unknown to the general public. There were occasional outbreaks. Some were small. Others were more serious. But most of the world barely noticed. The virus was largely associated with remote areas of Central Africa. It seemed distant, almost impossible to imagine. To many people living thousands of kilometers away, Ebola was a problem that belonged to another world. But infectious diseases have a way of reminding humanity that distance is not always protection. The virus itself was mysterious. Scientists believed that certain species of fruit bats were likely natural reservoirs of Ebola viruses, although the exact ecological pathways involved can be complex. Humans could become infected through contact with infected animals or through transmission between people. Once a person became infected, symptoms could include fever, severe weakness, muscle pain, vomiting, diarrhea, and in some cases bleeding. But one of the most frightening aspects of Ebola was its unpredictability. Some patients survived. Others did not. The disease could progress rapidly, overwhelming the body through severe illness and complications. And in places where hospitals lacked basic medical supplies, the chances of survival could be much lower. There was another problem. Fear. When people heard that a deadly disease was spreading, fear could become almost as powerful as the virus itself. People became afraid to visit hospitals. Families sometimes hid sick relatives. Communities could distrust medical teams. Rumors spread. And every rumor made the work of controlling an outbreak more difficult. For decades, Ebola remained a dangerous but relatively limited threat. Then came 2014. And everything changed. Chapter 3: The Outbreak That Changed Everything. The year was 2014. In West Africa, countries including Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone were facing a crisis unlike anything they had experienced before. The outbreak had begun in Guinea and soon crossed borders. Ebola was spreading. And this time, the virus was moving through densely populated areas and major cities. This was not a small outbreak in a remote village. This was something much bigger. The international community began to pay attention. At first, many people outside Africa did not understand the scale of what was happening. Then the numbers began to rise. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Treatment centers filled. Medical workers were becoming infected. And the virus continued moving. The most frightening part was that Ebola did not need to infect millions of people to create enormous suffering. It only needed to reach the right places. A family. A hospital. A funeral. A community. A city. One infected person could begin a chain of transmission. And every link in that chain represented another human life. In some communities, traditional funeral practices became a major challenge. Funerals were deeply important. Families wanted to touch their loved ones. They wanted to wash and prepare the body. They wanted to say goodbye. But if the person had died from Ebola, their body could still carry infectious virus. The traditions that brought comfort during grief could unintentionally contribute to further transmission. This created an impossible situation. Families were being asked to change practices that had existed for generations. And they were being asked to do it while grieving. Fear and mistrust grew. Some communities believed that foreign medical workers were responsible for the disease. Others feared that hospitals were places where people went to die. Rumors spread through villages and cities. And in the middle of this chaos, healthcare workers continued their work. Chapter 4: The People Behind the Masks. One of the most recognizable images of the Ebola epidemic was the medical worker in protective clothing. A full-body suit. Gloves. Boots. A mask. Goggles. Everything designed to create a barrier between the worker and the virus. But working in such equipment was exhausting. The heat could be unbearable. The protective suits trapped body heat. Medical workers could become dehydrated. Communication was difficult. Even a simple task could take enormous effort. And every movement had to be carefully controlled. A mistake could have consequences. Healthcare workers had to follow strict procedures. How to enter an isolation area. How to examine a patient. How to remove contaminated protective equipment. How to disinfect surfaces. How to leave without carrying the virus with them. The process required discipline. But behind every protective suit was a human being. A doctor. A nurse. A laboratory technician. A cleaner. A driver. A volunteer. People who had families of their own. People who were afraid. Some healthcare workers became infected. Some died. Their deaths were devastating. Every medical worker lost meant not only a personal tragedy, but also a reduction in the ability of the healthcare system to respond. The epidemic exposed another uncomfortable truth. In many of the affected countries, healthcare systems were already under enormous pressure. Hospitals lacked resources. There were not enough doctors and nurses. Laboratories were limited. Transportation was difficult. And in some areas, even basic protective equipment was scarce. The epidemic was not simply a battle against the virus. It was a battle against poverty, weak infrastructure, misinformation, fear, and time. Chapter 5: A World Watching. As the epidemic continued, the rest of the world began watching. News reports showed images of empty streets, treatment centers, protective suits, ambulances, and people waiting for help. The word Ebola became a global symbol of fear. Airports introduced screening procedures. Governments prepared emergency plans. Scientists worked urgently to develop treatments and vaccines. For the first time, many people who had never heard of Ebola were asking the same question: could this disease reach us? The answer was yes. But that did not mean the world was about to experience a global Ebola pandemic. Ebola has important characteristics that make it different from highly transmissible respiratory viruses. It is generally spread through direct contact with infected bodily fluids rather than through casual contact or ordinary airborne transmission. That meant that identifying cases, isolating patients, tracing contacts, and using appropriate protective measures could significantly slow transmission. But those measures required resources. And they required trust. Without trust, even the best medical response could fail. This became one of the central lessons of the epidemic. Fighting an infectious disease is not only about medicine. It is also about communication. People need accurate information. They need to understand what is happening. They need to believe that healthcare workers are there to help. And they need to know that their fears are being heard. Chapter 6: The Search for a Vaccine. For decades, Ebola had no widely available licensed vaccine. Scientists had studied the virus for years. But the relatively small number of outbreaks meant that research and development moved slowly compared with diseases that affected millions of people every year. The 2014 epidemic changed that. The scale of the crisis created an urgent need for effective tools. Researchers accelerated vaccine development. Clinical studies were conducted. Different vaccine candidates were evaluated. Eventually, an Ebola vaccine became an important part of outbreak response. This was a major scientific achievement. But a vaccine alone could not solve everything. An outbreak could still spread if cases were not detected. If people did not seek medical care. If contacts were not traced. If communities did not trust public health teams. The fight against Ebola became a combination of science and human cooperation. Laboratory testing helped identify infections. Contact tracing helped find people who may have been exposed. Isolation reduced opportunities for transmission. Supportive medical care helped patients survive. Vaccination helped protect people at risk. And community engagement helped make all of these measures possible. Slowly, the epidemic began to lose momentum. But the damage had already been enormous. Thousands of people had died. Families had been destroyed. Communities had been traumatized. And entire countries had been changed. Chapter 7. The fight was not over. For a moment, it seemed like the world could finally breathe again. But Ebola did not disappear. The virus remained in nature. And new outbreaks continued to occur. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, repeated outbreaks demonstrated how difficult it could be to control the disease in areas affected by conflict and instability. Medical workers faced challenges beyond the virus itself. Some treatment centers had to operate in dangerous environments. Public health workers sometimes struggled to reach communities. Mistrust and misinformation could make people suspicious of medical teams. And every delay created opportunities for the virus to spread. One of the most important lessons was that outbreaks could not be controlled by laboratories alone. Scientists could develop vaccines. Doctors could treat patients. But the communities themselves had to be part of the response. People needed to know why isolation was necessary. Why contact tracing mattered. Why safe burials were important. Why healthcare workers wore protective equipment. And why reporting symptoms early could save lives. The fight against Ebola became a lesson in the importance of trust. Chapter 8. What Ebola taught the world. The Ebola epidemics changed the way the world thought about emerging infectious diseases. Before 2014, Ebola was often viewed as a rare disease that appeared occasionally in remote areas. After 2014, that perception changed. The world realized that even a disease with limited natural transmission could become a major international emergency if it reached large populations and healthcare systems were not prepared. The epidemic also revealed the importance of global cooperation. No single country could solve the crisis alone. Scientists needed to share information. Medical teams needed support. Governments needed to cooperate. International organizations needed to coordinate their response. And local communities needed to be involved. The epidemic also highlighted the importance of investing in healthcare systems before a crisis begins. It is easy to think about preparedness when an outbreak is already happening. But by then, it may be too late. Preparedness means having trained healthcare workers. Laboratories capable of diagnosing infections. Emergency response systems. Protective equipment. Vaccines. Treatment centers. And clear communication strategies. These things may seem unnecessary when everything is calm. But during an epidemic, they can become the difference between control and catastrophe. Chapter 9. The Human Cost. Statistics can tell us how many people died. But statistics cannot explain what those numbers mean. Behind every number was a person. A mother. A father. A child. A friend. A doctor. A nurse. Someone with dreams. Someone with a family. Someone who expected to wake up the next morning. The Ebola epidemic left thousands of families grieving. Children lost parents. Parents lost children. Healthcare workers lost colleagues. Entire communities experienced collective trauma. And even those who survived faced difficult challenges. Some survivors experienced long-term health problems. Others faced social stigma. People sometimes feared survivors because they did not understand the disease or how transmission worked. In some cases, survivors were treated as if they were dangerous. This created another battle. The battle to rebuild lives after the outbreak. Survivors became important voices in the fight against Ebola. Their experiences helped communities understand that survival was possible. They also helped educate others about the disease. Their stories reminded the world that an epidemic does not end when the number of new cases reaches zero. The psychological and social consequences can last for years. Chapter 10: The Virus We Cannot Forget. Today, Ebola remains a serious infectious disease. But humanity is far better prepared than it was during the earliest outbreaks. Scientists understand much more about the virus. Vaccines are available for certain Ebola virus species. Medical teams have developed better strategies for outbreak response. Diagnostic testing has improved. And lessons from past epidemics continue to shape global health planning. But the threat has not disappeared. As long as the virus remains in nature, there is a possibility of future outbreaks. The goal is not to pretend that outbreaks will never happen. The goal is to detect them early. Respond quickly. Protect healthcare workers. Support affected communities. And prevent a small outbreak from becoming a catastrophe. The history of Ebola teaches us something important about infectious diseases. The most dangerous moment is often not when the world knows there is an outbreak. It is the moment before anyone realizes one has begun. When the first person becomes sick. When the first symptoms appear. When the first doctor wonders whether this is something unusual. When the first chain of transmission begins. That is why surveillance matters. That is why medical research matters. That is why healthcare infrastructure matters. And that is why the experiences of previous epidemics must never be forgotten. The final chapter. Imagine a small village. The sun is setting. People are returning home. Children are playing. Families are preparing dinner. Everything seems normal. But somewhere nearby, an invisible virus is moving from one person to another. Nobody knows yet. No alarms are ringing. No headlines have been written. No cameras are watching. This is how many outbreaks begin. Quietly. Almost invisibly. The story of Ebola is frightening because it reminds us how vulnerable human beings can be. But it is also a story of resilience. When the virus appeared, people were afraid. But they did not give up. Doctors continued treating patients. Nurses continued caring for the sick. Scientists continued searching for answers. Communities learned new ways to protect themselves. Survivors spoke about their experiences. And the world responded. The Ebola epidemics showed humanity at its most vulnerable. But they also showed humanity at its most courageous. The virus could not be defeated by fear. It could not be stopped by ignorance. It could not be controlled by one person or one country. It required knowledge, cooperation, trust, science, and compassion. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson Ebola left behind. An epidemic is never only about a virus. It is about people. It is about how societies respond when the unexpected happens. It is about whether we choose fear or understanding, isolation or cooperation, panic or preparation. The story of Ebola is not finished. New outbreaks may occur. New diseases may emerge. And the world will once again be tested. But every lesson learned from the past gives humanity a better chance of facing the future. Because the next epidemic may begin in a place nobody is watching. It may start with a single person. A single fever. A single unexplained illness. And when that happens, the question will not be whether humanity has faced something like this before. The question will be whether humanity remembered what it learned. The story of Ebola is a warning. But it is also a reminder. That knowledge saves lives. That preparation matters. And that even in the darkest moments of an epidemic, there are always people willing to step forward and help. Doctors, nurses, Scientists, volunteers, survivors, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They are the reason outbreaks can be stopped. They are the reason lives can be saved. And they are the reason the story of Ebola is not only a story of death. It is also a story of courage. A story of science. A story of survival. And above all, a story about humanity's continuing fight against the invisible threats that surround us.